I'm Yvonne.
And I'm Kuan. Thank you for watching Razor TV and joining us on Point Blank.
Making the cut on our show tonight is, you guessed it, U.S. President George Bush.
Yes, George Bush has been under fire for quite some time now,
so
right?
that's become juicy, yeah?
Yes, and on his mistakes in going into an era alone and U.S. being unilateral in his economic and foreign policies.
Well, last week we looked at Fareed Zakaria's article in Newsweek entitled "What Bush Got Right."
Yes.
Well, it looks at how Bush may have made huge mistakes early on, but rectified those mistakes later on. Well, to get another perspective, today I spoke with Professor T.J. Pempel from University of California, Berkeley. Well, Professor Pempel's in Singapore to give a public lecture on Tuesday at the Kuan School of Public Policy. Interestingly enough, the lecture's entitled "How Bush Bungled Asia."
Oh, it seems like a totally opposite perspective, right, that he's talking about.
Yeah,
but before we take a look at that interview, we have with us today Mr. Richard Bitzinger, who is a senior fellow with the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Nanyang Technological University.
Yeah,
Hi,
people
welcome.
must be wondering who he was. Yes.
Yeah. Hi.
So, Mr. Bitzinger, what do you think? These are pretty interesting titles. What Bush got right, and Pempel's
How Bush Bungled Asia.
Yeah, these are pretty huge claims.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, the truth probably is somewhere in between, as the typical kind of mugwumpy professor's response to these things.
Moderate and sensitive.
Bush, I guess, the old line is "stop clock is right twice a day," at least. And Bush did get a few things right. And I think I have a lot of respect for Fareed Zakaria's insights. And, so, I mean, I'm sure Bush has done some things. I mean, not a total write-off as a president. Bungling is a pretty strong term, too.
Okay.
I'd like to see what he says that he bungled. I mean, obviously, Bush's foreign policy, and particularly his defense, around the world, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, he's made a lot of mistakes.
Famously
Whether or not they're irreversible mistakes, I mean, in my opinion, that's really the sign of bungling.
Okay. Well, some critics have looked at Bush in a kinder light, right?
Yes.
I would say that he has righted some wrongs later on in his term.
Yeah, but Dr. Pempel is of the mind that Bush bungled Asia, and in a very, very damaging way.
Yep, let's take a look. What is your take on U.S. relations with Asia? And when you say Bush bungled Asia, what exactly do you mean?
Well, I think that basically there's a realization that the United States foreign policy has had disastrous consequences in places like the Middle East and Latin America, and even with what Donald Rumsfeld called Old Europe as a result of the war in Iraq and the wars in Afghanistan as well. But many people say that relations between Bush and Asia have actually been quite good. And my point is that they are not as bad as they are in the Middle East, but that sets a very low standard, and that relations in Asia have in many areas deteriorated as a result of the Bush policies. And I could get more specific. I mean, essentially, American policy for a long period of time with regard to Asia was a balance between military and security policy, but also economics. The U.S. attempted to promote democracy, be somewhat sensitive to cultural differences, promote the United States as a place where people might want to come to study. So it was a rather complex, multidisciplinary approach to Asia. Bush essentially, I think, focused almost exclusively on military activities and ignored America's economic relations with the region, did a lot to roll back visa policies, make it harder for Asians and others to get into the United States, and went through a whole series of things that I think undermine things. And I think there's been a tremendous fall off in public support across Asia for the United States. All of the public opinion polls that you look at, BBC, Pew, et cetera, show just a calamitous collapse of public opinion toward the United States.
A calamitous collapse of public opinion towards Bush. Do you think he bungled Asia?
Well, first of all, I mean, the way people feel about Bush is going to be distinct from the way they feel about America. And, Bush had a huge upswell, as did the United States, but in association, after 9/11. I mean, everybody was an American, so to speak. And of course, he kind of squandered that, not necessarily going into Iraq, but basically not delivering a quick, decisive victory.
Yep.
And there's going to be a spillover for that. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's irredeemable. And in fact, I can guarantee you that, whether it's Obama or McCain who's elected in November, that probably there will be what we call a honeymoon period, globally as well as nationally. And, America will be seen as having a chance in order to sort of, regroup and recapture that. I mean, there's still a lot of sound things about America, in terms of its soft power, its cultural, appeal and everything like that. That I think still has a lot of sway. And I don't want to be this kind of alarmist as I'm hearing Professor Pempel being, though I can see his arguments, I really can.
Mm-hmm. So you think that to claim that Bush bungled Asia is alarmist and making too much
well,
of a mountain
until
out
I
of a
actually
molehill?
hear him telling me exactly what he means by bungling, I mean, we can all form an opinion as to what we'd like to see, see Bush do better, or what we'd like to see any American president do better. And certainly, as he points out correctly, if things aren't as bad here as they are in the Middle East, and that's setting the bar rather low. And I would say that probably in terms of immediate security concerns to the United States, Asia is certainly second after the Middle East. I mean, this is a very important region because, as I like to say, it's one of a lot of dynamism. There's a lot of things that are happening and continuing to happen, and there's a lot of unresolved problems, and not the least of which I understand we'll get into later, is China. And how do we deal with China? How does everyone deal with China?
That's a good question. Well, we're going to get to that a bit later on. Oh, well, like Professor Pempel, some critics have said that Bush, the very Bush, well, he largely ignored Asia. And with the Bush administration came rising protectionism. Well, how does that affect Asia? Let's take a look at what Professor Pempel thinks. In terms of trade, how is that, with the rise of protectionism as a consequence of his decisions and in terms of economic policies, what ramifications have we seen in Asia?
For one thing, the United States was negotiating a free trade agreement with Korea, for example. That is now being held up in the U.S. Congress. It's causing great chaos in Korea because of the fears of U.S. beef imports going into Korea. There are fears that it's not safe. And the Free Trade Pact will probably be held up for at least a year or so. The protectionism is also affecting, I think, relations with ASEAN, for example. As you know, China entered into a free trade pact with ASEAN in 2001, and that's now being brought forward. China was very smart in that and very tactically deft because basically what it did was accept an awful lot of Southeast Asian agricultural exports, particularly from countries like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. And that, I think, won a lot of plaudits and applause from people in the ASEAN countries. The United States now is moving toward protectionism, can offer nothing like the same sort of generosity toward Asian exports, particularly in the areas that are critical to the ASEAN countries, like textiles or shoes or foods, agricultural products. And just to be fair, Japan is in much the same situation. So China's influence is going up, and I think with regard to trade, America's influence is falling quite a bit as a result of many of the Bush policies.
Okay, what does this mean to what are the consequences that Asia has to face because of U.S.'s protectionism? In this case, you are talking about U.S. falling in terms of global opinion for not stepping up the way China is. So what does it? Okay, so U.S. has sort of missed out in that regard, but we'll deal with that later on. But in terms of Asia, how has Asia missed out in terms of as a result of U.S. economic policy?
Well, I think one of the things that Asia is doing, and it may be missing out, it may not be missing out, it may be helping Asia in some respects, but there's been a wave of efforts by the countries of Asia to create new regional institutions, the ASEAN +3, revitalizing the ASEAN Regional Forum, creating the East Asia Summit, the Chiang Mai Initiative, a whole series of these things. And for the most part, these are institutions that are for Asians only. In many ways, they're a reflection of the pattern that Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir, proposed with the East Asian Economic Caucus, what a lot of cynics in the West call a caucus without Caucasians. But what's been happening in the last, let's say, 7 or 8 years has been the effort by a number of Asian countries to try to create institutions, create bodies of cooperation among Asians from which the United States has basically been excluded. That may be good for Asians in many ways. I mean, I'm of mixed minds in that regard because the United States has long been a big 800-pound gorilla in Asia.
Monolithic sort of, power.
Monolithic, hegemonic, I mean, you can pick your term. And it might be very good, at least in the short run, for the countries and the people of Asia to think about how they want to organize their collective lives and to be able to do it without the heavy shadow of the United States hanging over them. So in some respects, that may be a very positive thing. But I think in the long run, cooperative relations between the United States and Asia are really in the best interests of both. So what Bush may have done in some ways is give Asia a nice breathing space of 7 or 8 years in which his desire to act unilaterally has worked nicely with Asia's interest in becoming more multilateral and given Asia a chance to do things in a bit more cooperative way. And so when they turn back to the United States, as I expect they will, they may come with a much clearer collective sense of what they want to do, how they want to do things, and be a little less subject to being pushed around or strong-armed by the United States.
So you're saying with U.S. sort of stepping aside and sort of accidentally allowing this new regionalism to arise, it has actually done Asia some good in empowering them.
I think that's right. So there may be, I mean, one of the cliches of, is that every cloud has a silver lining, and this may be the silver lining to Bush's disastrous policies. Asians may benefit in some ways that they had not anticipated.
Even though it's kind of accidental or
exactly
not planned for.
Yeah, the accidental Asianist.
Bush, the accidental Asianist. Well, some of our viewers already are commenting on our website, and let's take a look at what they're saying. Yeah, right. Red Devil.
Yeah. Red Devil 72 said, President Bush is a leader who doesn't lead by popular consent. That's true leadership, not swaying according to what people want. It's not easy being in his position. Once he makes up his mind, he sticks to his decision because he believes it's the right thing to do.
Well, clearly Masba kind of believes in that silver lining that Professor Pempel is talking about. He thinks that Bush's cowboy approach to foreign policy is actually quite refreshing. Rule by majority is a function of democracy, but sometimes a more dictatorial style of leadership, or for want of a better word, is necessary to make the tough decisions. Here are two viewers who think that Bush is in an unfortunate position of being between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, you can admire someone who basically sticks to his guns, but if they're an idiot, they're an idiot.
Foolishly sticking to your guns.
I mean, to a certain extent, is that there's the old joke about why do you hit yourself against a brick wall? Because it feels so good when you stop. And the thing is that I think that certainly in cases like in Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, Bush has gotten so many signals that his policies are not working out the way that they intended it to. And therefore, not changing is not a sign, in my opinion, of determination and guts. Is just a sign of being foolish. So I can certainly see how someone could say, well, he keeps his eyes on the prize, but if the prize is something that's no longer there, it's vetted. I have to disagree with those points.
Well, it's interesting that Professor Pempel, on another note, has pointed out that in U.S.'s, what the critics call U.S.'s neglect of Asia, that it has given rise to a new regionalism.
Regionalism that happens
That's
in
right,
Asia.
for Asia. And that's gives Asia a chance to sort of regroup and collectively, rethink its identity, rethink its partnerships.
Yeah.
So what do you say to that,
Well, I think that is true. I mean, first keep in mind, Bush came into office. Fighting terrorism was not even on his to-do list
That's
at
right.
all.
That's right.
I can guarantee you that on September 10th, 2001, in fact, China was probably at the top of that list. They were very concerned. It was right after the EP3 incident, and there was this new neoconservative look at China that saw China as a rising, not just economic power, but a military power, and one that was potentially very threatening. So actually, Asia was very high. Northeast Asia. I can guarantee you that Southeast Asia is always kind of an by the way kind of part of U.S. foreign policy. I apologize for that, but that's just sort of the way it is in a lot of ways. But after that, of course, terrorism became job one, and it still generally preoccupies this administration. I mean, one of the sad things I have to tell people about the U.S. foreign policy is that the United States government is kind of like a 2-year-old child. We can only concentrate on one thing at a time.
Can't multitask.
Yeah. No, they don't multitask. I mean, you'd think that they could. The other thing you got to keep in mind is that, particularly under Condoleezza Rice, I mean, she was a Sovietologist. I mean, she studied a country that doesn't even exist anymore. And a lot of her way of looking at the world is colored through that kind of lens. And so, for example, she sees China in a certain sense, I'm sweeping generalization here, as kind of like a Asian Soviet Union. And of course, it's obviously much more complicated than
That's right.
And so, I mean, not saying they didn't have really smart people who knew Asia, like Christopher Hill, and people like that, in the State Department and the Defense Department, who knew Asia. It's just that they always had a tendency to get shunted onto back burner issues or things that, well, for example, in the North Korean, six-party talks. I mean, that was very important. But yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, the United States is distracted, looking elsewhere, and in the meantime, that gives China an opportunity to move in. And of course, and I think he makes a good point. It gives a chance for Asians to work out perhaps these kinds of intra-Asian associations and forums and stuff like that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, that's right. Well, since you are such a Rice fan. All right. Well, Masba thinks on our web, one of the viewers commented, accidental Asianist, accidental president. He thinks Bush became president by accident. Bush is an accident in many ways, but sometimes it takes an accident or calamity to right things or to make things move in new directions. Aquarius thinks that protectionism is a short-sighted way of running a country. It only fixes short-term problems, not long-term. So made in China imports for a while. How will that help revitalize the U.S. economy? He goes on to talk about the automobile industry in America as well. And despite the many protectionist measures of shutting out, especially Japan imports to begin with, lots of issues to deal with here.
Red devil again? Yeah.
Someone's talking about you, Richard. He's talking on hindsight. Who knew how Iraq and Afghanistan would have turned out like it did today? Let me ask Richard, did it seem like the right thing to do at that time? How do you negotiate or reason with someone like Saddam Hussein? It's a good point. Since he's talking to you, Richard, I think it's all yours.
Okay, well, we're getting into an area where I look, what's done is done. I admit this. But, I mean, the point is, if you go back to 2002, 2003, the pretexts for going to war against Iraq basically never panned out. Of course, he didn't have the weapons of mass destruction. I think it was pretty obvious, even then, that the evidence was pretty weak or even flaccid. Yeah, no one likes dictators. I mean, I'm an American. We all have this kind of gut feeling in favor of democracy, multi-party democracies, and all these types of freedoms. And of course, he was a horrible guy. And unfortunately, the world is full of horrible, horrible people. And the thing is, if you start creating precedents for saying, well, if you're a dictator, we have the right to go in and replace you. Then you can sort of say, well, then don't you have the obligation to go into other places which have equally awful regimes, and then happen, by the way, to be pretty good friends of you, and maybe even provide you with a lot of oil. What I say, it smacks a bit of hypocrisy. Plus, basically, the point is this, is that we had Saddam Hussein pretty well boxed up. I mean, we had the no-fly zones, we had embargoes against him, we had effectively defanged him militarily. I mean, he wasn't an active threat. He certainly wasn't the threat that, you could argue that Iranian-based or Iranian-supported terrorism was, or something, or certainly what Al-Qaeda was and everything, which was getting most of its support from a variety of private sources.
Even Saudi Arabia, right? Which has worked closely with
not the Saudi government itself. I mean, but Saudi people. I mean, there was that. So I mean, again, yes. I mean, he was a bad guy, but guess what? The world is full of bad guys, and we have a tendency to be able to find ways to live with them and deal with them, short of having to spend close to about 700 billion trillion billion, sorry, zeros, but it's $700 billion that we've basically flushed down the toilet in that country, and I just don't see the cost-benefit analysis of this. I really don't.
Yeah, well, two of our viewers have an opinion about Asia. Aquarius thinks that Bush has neglected Asia because he can't speak Asian.
Yeah.
Aquarius thinks that he's being rude, but he said it anyway. Okay. I think it's best to maintain a distance if you're not familiar with something, or your ignorance will be more apparent. Aquarius is asking who are the Asian experts on his team, if Condoleezza Rice is his main source of counsel, advice. So who are the Asian experts on his team? Good question.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a while since I've been in Washington, so I've been a little out of touch, and I'm embarrassed to say. I mean, I know that Christopher Hill was put on the team in order to be the negotiator for the six-party talks.
Okay.
God, there's names I cannot remember right now. I mean, they had some good people. The problem is that they all kind of existed at the kind of assistant secretary level.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of people that they had. They had Michael Green in the National Security Council. I mean, they had some really good people. It's just a lot of these people cycle through. And particularly one of the problems you have is in the last couple of years of an administration, people have a tendency to bolt because they're not waiting to get fired when a new president
Leave before the X falls.
Yeah. And also while they're on the top of their game and they can,
Blaze
sort
of
of
glory.
parlay that into a nice think tank job or something like that. So I think he had good people. It's just that I think they make a good point. I mean, Bush wasn't an Asianist, but then Bush really didn't have any foreign policy experience anyway. So
that's true.
And there's the old joke that 90% of politics is local. I mean, you get elected president, and you're basically judged as being president on how well you can do things at home. The economy, bread and butter issues, and of course since 9/11, keeping the country's people safe from terrorism. Foreign policy always tends to be kind of a back burner issue. It flares up every once in a while.
Okay.
Good point.
So even though the ties, U.S. ties with many Asian countries, both in West Asia, South Asia, have been damaged, do you think there is a chance that U.S. can repair these ties with these zones?
Yeah. I mean, I don't see anything catastrophic or irredeemable in the relationship, because the United States is always going to be important to Asian nations. I mean, they're always. I mean, it still is the world's sole remaining superpower. It still has a lot of, I like to think, benign characteristics and benevolence. That it's serving its own
Nothing
stuff.
to do with you being American, yeah?
Yeah, okay. No one likes to think their country as just being
yes, that's all right, Richard.
Evil or something like that, and I don't think it is. I mean, I think as a hegemon, the United States is a pretty beneficial, pretty benevolent one. And so, for one thing, it has no territorial ambitions or aspirations. It's not going to fight over fishing rights in the South China Sea, or things like the Spratly Islands or something like that. So our interests here are basically one of peace and stability, I mean, obviously, we believe in the status quo, and that status quo preserves the preeminence of the United States. I'm not denying that. But I'm saying is that, at the very least, Asians should be happy to know that the United States is way, way over in North America, and it's not seeking to turn anybody here into a territory of the U.S.
Yeah. Well, let's see what the preeminent U.S. has got to offer Singapore right after the break.